So, hello everybody. My name is Carol Johnson, and I'm going to be your host for this Silver Bow Publishing book launch. And today I'm delighted to introduce to you Iain McLachlan. Iain was born in Scotland to a Scottish father and Irish mother. He has been all over the world and loves to travel. He runs his own business, teaching first aid, and spent nearly 30 years working pre-hospital. His interests include reading, rugby, ice hockey, biathlon, and he is a qualified sailing skipper. Iain is just as happy sailing as he is walking in the Mourne Mountains. Now, at this point, I would normally introduce to you all Candace James, who is Silver Bow Publishing, but actually, unfortunately, Candace is not available today. So I am just going to ask Iain to begin his reading.
Anyway, yes, thank you, by the way, Carol, for doing this. Thank you for hosting this, and this really does mean a lot. Over the last wee while, Candace and I have been chatting, emailing, etc., about the moon dancing books. So far we've published 3 volumes, 1, 2, and 3, and we looked at the feedback we were getting from people who were buying them and reading them, etc. And when we kept on seeing the same thing again, we agreed this is something that we can work through. So we did a complete re-edit, resizing, etc. And we've decided to do this relaunch of volumes 1, 2, and 3 is what we're going to do tonight, which is all exciting. I'm actually really pleased that Candace was able to help with this. So I'm really pleased with that. So volume one of this part. My books are mostly set in Northern Ireland. I've looked at the genre of werewolves, but I'm looking at it from a completely different angle. I'm deliberately gone away from myth, fantasy, etc. And because I come from a medical background, I looked at this subject from a biological point of view. Biologically, could this be possible? So I was doing lots of research, etc. I spoke with a chemical physicist, spoke with biologists, and researched that. And over a period of time, I found out that biologically, is it possible? Actually, yes, it is. But they kept stressing what you see in a film, someone taking like 30 seconds or 60 seconds. For that to happen for real, that would be 8 months, 10 months, maybe 12. It couldn't happen that quickly. Can it happen? Yes. Can it happen that quickly? No. I also then started looking at the myths and legends around werewolves, and I noticed a huge difference in the myth and folklore between what we have here in Ireland. When I talk about Ireland in past tense, today, as we talk now, Ireland, you've got the Republic of Ireland, and then you've got Northern Ireland. When I talk about Ireland, I'm going back 4,000, 5,000 years. It was just the island of Ireland. The myths and legends of werewolves in Ireland's were seen as heroes. They were protectors, they were warriors. Yet when I looked at the myths and fantasy of werewolves in Central Europe, it was the bloodshot eyes, drooling mouth, rage, killing everything in sight. And it was when I was looking at this and kept seeing this again, and the actual descriptions, especially from French, German, folklore, etc., modern day Austria, modern day Czech Republic, etc. And I kept seeing the same thing. And from a medical background, I started recognizing what I was actually reading was the signs and symptoms of rabies. Yet here in the British Isles, England, Scotland, Wales, Ireland, we've never had rabies on these islands, ever. So I was looking at that. So that made me, that put ideas in my head as well. And in Irish folklore, there are various tales. There was a group of warriors over 4,000 years ago called the Red Branch Warriors, and they controlled most of modern day Ireland. and the seat of power at the time, the great ancient kings of Ireland, was set in a place called Hill of Tara, which is a real place, and I use that in my stories. They would sit in that, and in the time of war, there was an entire, I found out there was an entire clan of werewolves in Ireland, and they would be hired by the great kings to protect. They would seen as warriors. So it was like, that got me started, that got me thinking. If this was real, how could it be real? And how would they exist in a modern society? They've existed for 4,000 or 5,000, how would they exist today? And also, how would a modern society start to react if it was start to become apparent that maybe these creatures are real? You know, I watched a very good documentary on the great Professor Stephen Hawking, and back in the 1970s, when he was first putting scientific papers together about the existence of black holes, he was laughed at. There was people stood up and stormed out of his lectures, and yet here we are, 50 years later, and they've actually now managed to photograph one. There's now photographic that they actually exist. So that's in 50 years. So how much more could be learned over 4,000 years? So that's where that comes from. So what I'm going to read to you from volume 1, it's set later in the book. I know that quite a few of the people that are going to be watching, either live or later on, I've read most of this. And this first part is two of my main characters. Tony Fallon is a former soldier who is now a police officer, and he's not long married, and he's got his wife Karen, and his best friend is called Kyle, and Kyle Foster is a former legionnaire. He was in the French Foreign Legion. Tony is a werewolf, whereas Kyle hasn't discovered yet at this part of the story his ancestry, because he's actually from his ancestry is from this clan of werewolves, but he's in the process of finding this out. And Karen has invited them out for a picnic, so they've gone to an area just outside the town of Coleraine, which is in Northern Ireland, which is where a lot of volume 1 is set. When you're reading my work, all the locations I'm talking about are real. Coleraine, the northwest coast of Northern Ireland, my descriptions are real because I want people to see my home the way that I see it. I love where I live. I absolutely love this wee country. And certainly over the last 40 years, when people talk about Northern Ireland, violence, religious bigotry, etc., that's not the country I see today. So this is another reason why I describe real places. So they're outside Coleraine and they're having a little picnic. They've been sat there a while, and Tony has become aware of something. Tony paused and looked around the edge of the clearing. He looked down at his watch. They had been there about 40 minutes, and he thought to himself, as his eyes darted over the tall trees that acted as a barrier between the eating area and the wood itself. He felt himself stir. Across from him, with his back to the woods, Kyle was sitting, but he picked up Tony's reaction. "What?" he asked. Tony didn't answer. Karen stopped mid-sentence and then looked at her husband's now emotionless face. She looked over at Kyle, who met her glance. He did not seem overly worried, almost as if she'd been in the situation before. "Tony," Kyle raised his voice. Tony's body broke from the stare and looked at Kyle's face. "What?" he asked. "I just asked you that," Kyle stated. Kyle turned on the bench to face the same direction that Tony had been looking. Kyle shifted in his seat and then turned back to Tony, who was slowly lowering his hands and placed the paper mug and half-eaten sandwich back on his paper plate. "What did you see?" Kyle asked. Tony's concentration had returned to the wood. "Not sure. Something's in the woods." Tony was almost stammering as he spoke. Kyle spun round and let his eyes search the tree line. They fixed on nothing. He could not see what his friend could. Tony's body suddenly flicked up, and Kyle reacted to his movement. Tony did not realise it, but his right hand had now covered the grip of his Glock pistol that he carried hidden underneath his top. Karen drew back. "What's there?" Kyle raised his voice slightly. He knew Tony was reacting for a reason. From inside the woods, they could suddenly hear clapping, cheering, and jeering. "Are you armed?" Tony asked as he started to rise from the bench. "Yes, of course I am." Kyle also started to rise. Tony stepped away from the bench and took a couple of steps towards the woods. Something was wrong. Something was very, very wrong. Kyle glanced at Tony. He knew that something was about to happen. Kyle had been in the past able to sense danger, but Tony seemed to pick it up strongly. Kyle knew that since they'd been working together, he'd learned to trust the instinct well. "What is it?" Karen asked. Neither of them turned towards her. They both faced the woods. "Tony, what is it?" Karen almost shouted to repeat her question. Kyle picked up on the slight nervousness that had crept into her voice. Tony no doubt had heard the same. He stopped. Kyle looked over at him. Was he sniffing the wind? "Karen," Tony spoke quietly before he stepped forward with his right foot, his hand now under his top. He now had a secure grip on the pistol. Kyle's right hand unconsciously did the same. His attention became fixed on the woods. A feeling of danger was creeping up at him. There was something dangerous in the woods. He could make out the quieter, muffled sounds, as they could now hear after the cheering and laughter had suddenly stopped. "Yes," she answered. "Pack up the things and wait in the car." Kyle glanced back at Karen as he expected to protest, at least what Tony had just said, but she wasn't. She started throwing the food into the holdall and cleared the top of the table as fast as she possibly could. "Stay in the car and lock the doors," Tony continued to say as his eyes hunted the gaps in the woods. Kyle stepped closer to him but kept facing the trees. "Mucker, what do you see?" Kyle had lowered his voice to ask the question. "I'm not sure, but..." Tony was suddenly cut off by the piercing sound of screaming. The screaming was a mix of male and female voices that came from inside the woods. They were already running towards the path that led into the woods as the screaming continued. They ran past the BMW and through the wooden posts that dictated the perimeter of the car park. The pathway snaked through the short grass and part of the trees. "This way," shouted Tony as he shot off down the left-hand path into the wood. Tony stopped beside a small brook that came down from the right and flowed under the pathway. Kyle stopped himself a few paces on. Tony extended his hand. "Stop!" he shouted. Tony started to turn to his right and look back into the forest. He had his weapon out of his holster and by his side. Kyle lifted his pistol out and stepped away from him so he could see what he was facing. Kyle tried to control his breathing as he listened to the forest, but the only sound they could hear was the running water and the thumping of his own heart inside his chest. "Where?" he quietly asked. Tony turned away from him so he was facing into the wood. Tony's left foot was a pace forward of the right and both knees had a slight bend. Tony was ready to engage whatever was out there. "We've come too far," he answered, and he slowly started to walk back up the path. He was completely focused on the forest. Cal kept up with him as he started to walk faster. "Yeah, over there." As Tony spoke, Kylie suddenly realized there was no birds, no sound of wildlife. The woodland had become quiet and very still, both of which amplified the sound. The silence was broken by the sound of snapping wood, which came from the far side of the patch of trees. Tony's pace quickened. "Up there," Tony pointed with his left hand at the slope of the hill and to the trees that covered. Right in front of him, his eyes caught a single leaf of a netted plant that had been sprayed blue. Just a single leaf, no other. Simple vandalism or a marker left for someone. Tony looked over his right shoulder as Cal followed on. He now broke into a trot. His attention never left the trees that were up to the left. They passed the bench again and carried on back down where they'd come. Slow and more deliberate this time. Cal's breath was returning as the pathway straightened out. "Over there." Cal followed him as he went down the trail. The floor of the forest changed from green to brown under the canopy of the trees. Tony had slowed and Cal still wanted to know what was ahead of him. But if Tony knew, would he have told him? Tony raised the pistol up so both arms were extended in front of him. Kyle did the same. He kept back and to Tony's right and made their way up the hill. The sound of the car horn in Castle Row made Kyle glance back over his right shoulder as he continued. Tony had slowed down. It was almost as if they were on a patrol and expected to find an enemy at any moment. Neither of them made a sound as they deliberately moved through the trees. Kyle tightened his grip on the familiar black weapon. Patches of green on the ground pointed to an obvious trail that had been trodden many times. The final beams of light of the setting sun lit patches of the ground around them as the darkness grew deeper. Kyle looked over the large mound of the earth that was up ahead. The far side of the mound was a clearing that was more brightly lit than where they currently were. The greyness of their surroundings seemed to welcome them both. Kyle could now smell something. He wasn't sure what it was, but he was picking something up. Tony was slowly breathing in and out of his nose as he moved. He seemed to absorb everything. Another small brook stretched in front of them, and a small bridge had naturally formed over it. The bridge was about 2 feet wide, but it served a purpose. A single tree was standing in the middle of the path at the far side of the brook, of earth either side of it. The clearing was now off to their right. Tony jumped first and then Kyle seconds later, both without making a sound. They passed the mounds and could see the black duffel coat that had been outstretched on the ground. A few other clothes were scattered over a few pairs of jeans, a single trainer, underwear, a crumpled shirt, a woman's red top. All were new, all were clean, and all were totally out of place. But up ahead, a deeper brook, and the area behind them was much darker, and they were drawn towards it. The far side of the brook had formed into a natural barrier that was at a different level. It had a natural entrance to the small area behind it that was about 20 meters wide and surrounded by trees. The far side of the clearing stopped at the very steep rise of the hill that went up nearly 70 meters. The entrance of this clearing was guarded by trees round which a left hand stretched around. A strip of bark where the hand had gripped was missing and blood slowly dripped from it. They jumped the small brook and landed the other side. Kyle landed with Tony on his right. Another fallen by his tree was to the left, and 4 of the trees formed a box in front of him. A large thick oak tree was off to his left, with the body of a young male slumped up against it. His back was towards Kyle. However, he could already make out the massive trauma wound to the side of his head, neck, shoulder, and right arm. Kyle stepped forward. He was already dead. A few feet to the right, far side of the tree, was a young female who lay on her side. Her feet and legs were bare, but she still wore her dark hooded top. The head looked up towards the hill, as if to expose how much of her throat had been ripped out. Her dark red earth was in sharp contrast to the pale whiteness of her young, shocked face. Cal moved over the fallen tree and looked at the young male that lay on his back with his arms and legs outstretched. There was blood all around him. Most of his face was missing, as was most of his throat. His chest had been ripped bare and his torso covered in deep lacerations with great force. Dead eyes looked into the darkening sky as Tony stopped. Tony moved behind Kyle and placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. He took a couple of paces towards the female. Kyle looked down at the body in front of him as he heard a couple of beeps. He looked over back at Tony as he stared, as he started to tap the number of the pad on his phone. Kyle stretched his neck and looked up the hill into the dark pair of eyes that looked down towards him. The dark eyes stared into his. The figure was standing upright with well-developed arms by its side. It was perfectly silhouetted against the sky behind it. The hair was a weird shape, the greyness of the darkness around the face and teeth that seemed to shine. Hair fanned out from the sides into 2 ears that pointed upwards. Was it smiling at him? Kyle looked at it for about 2 seconds, then his own body reacted by dropping down onto his right knee and pointing his pistol at the figure as it turned and vanished. "Police, stop!" Kyle screamed as loud as he could. He blinked and it was gone, and again his body was reacting by jumping forward to give chase when Tony cannoned into him by sending him crashing onto the earth. "Kyle, no!" Tony jumped to his feet and turned up the hill, standing over a startled Kyle. Is Miss Anrua? Tony shouted as loud as he could, then stepped back to allow Kyle to his feet. "What?" was all he could muster. Tony turned away from him and put his phone to his left ear. "Wait, please wait," Tony said as he holstered the pistol. "Now wait a minute," Cal was nearly shouting as he bounded towards Tony's back. Tony spun around and grabbed him by his outstretched hand. "They're gone." It was almost a whisper. "They? Who?" Cal's head slightly shook from side to side in confusion as he spoke. "Wait for what?" Tony lowered his head and his arm and started speaking into the police control room and started to describe what they just found. Kyle looked up the hill at the gap in the skyline where the figure had been standing. Confusion reigned in his head. The only sound he could hear was that of Tony's voice. His eyes looked across and found the missing head that was looking back at him. It was lying beside a tree and looked at them placed there. Suddenly, the far side of the oak, there was movement, and a young girl with blood dripping from her face stumbled and fell to the ground. "Survivor!" shouted Kyle. Tony looked up at the fumbling girl. "There's one still alive. We need an ambulance as well." Kyle rushed over to her. She was mumbling, her eyes wide, and darted back and forth in shock. Blood was splashed all over her face, her neck, her arms, and her body. She rolled onto her back. Hands waved in a hysterical way. Kyle could not make out a visible injury in her body. He knelt beside her. He struggled to reassure her. He looked up at Tony, who was still talking to the control room. "Injuries," Tony shouted. Kyle shook his head. "None that I can see. His blood isn't hers." Tony stepped back and relayed this down the phone. Kyle looked back at the girl, who fixed a look at him. He had seen fear before, but this was absolute terror. Her rambling continued as her feet fought with the earth and her hands fought with Kyle. Police officer, it's okay. We're police officers. You're okay, you're safe." And we'll leave that there.
What I really noticed about that reading, Iain, was the level of tension that just never shifted. Like, honestly, I was sitting here with my little heart racing.
Excellent.
Yeah. So you do a really great job of keeping the tension moving and going. And so tell me how you go about writing that kind of a scene. What kind of techniques, or maybe just tell me if it's natural.
The way that I write, my writing style, I'm normally doing one of three things. I'm either researching what I'm going to write next. I place a lot of value on research. That particular scene there, I spent 2 days at that real location walking round. When I've initially got my story plot, I view the story plot as a skeleton. So we've got the bits. This is going to happen, this is going to happen, this is going to happen. But when I'm actually researching it, I look at where could this happen, where logically would this happen, and what could be the reactions from the characters. I do base a lot of characters on real people. The character Tony was based on someone I used to work with a long time ago, and I initially got in touch with him, going, "What would you do next?" I do that with a lot of people. There's people that I use that are local to me. The character Cara Marie is a very good friend of mine. Certainly for book one, there was very much, because the character's a journalist, I'm not a journalist, but I wanted the journalistic character to be correct. So when, for example, if journalists read it, they pick up on, yes, that's right, that's right. Because in the past, when I've read books and it's a book, something that I know about, if it's nonsense, it can destroy a book for me completely. So I put a lot of value on research, location research and character research. I also have in the past used real people as role play. For example, for yourself, if I was basing a character on you, this is what's just happened, I would be another character, and we would sit with a recording device, knowing it's been recorded, and have a conversation. And I did that a lot with my friend Una, and because she was able to steer me very much so with the journalism, but what a journalist would do, and more importantly, what a journalist wouldn't do, because she wanted to keep it real. I got a friend of mine to introduce me to a real police detective when I first started looking at things like that. And that was very funny, because I don't know what he'd been told, apart from he's getting a free lunch. But inside a couple of minutes of werewolves, bye, he almost literally ran out the door, but he got lunch out of me. But the one thing he did say, he said, it's not something that the police would entertain. someone going, oh yeah, there's a group of werewolves over there and they're killing these people. No. The one thing he did say, which set me on the track, was in the event of 5 people's deaths, the initial job of the police is to gather science-based evidence, first of all, to produce to a coroner and then produce in a court of law. And that sort of, really? Okay. And then he sort of ran away. But that got me thinking that that's what they would do. So yeah, so that was good like that. So when I'm doing that, I'm either researching, and when I'm writing, or I'm editing what I've just written. And that can take a wee bit of time. So it's a step-by-step approach. When I've done a story plot, I've got basic plots. I'm planning a series of 6 books, and I've got the basis of that entire plot to right the way to the end of book 6. It's not just putting the meat, putting the actual bones of the body, putting the body on the bones, and so that's going to take a while. So it's a long process.
Right.
Sorry, Carol, I can't hear you.
No, it's okay. Sorry, I meant to unmute and then I muted myself. The question I had was about, it sounds like you're a plotter rather than a pantser. The pantsers kind of go by the seat of their pants, right? They write as they're feeling it. But a plotter, based on what I'm hearing from you, knows at the beginning, in some ways, what the story, how it's going to end.
Absolutely, yes.
They already, that's amazing for me. Yeah, that's certainly not the way I write. I find plotting really hard. Although now that you're talking about it, I will give it another try.
Yeah, I find it very easy to do. And when I first started writing, when I started talking reaching out to other authors, Sherry, who's listening in, is a fantastic author. I've read some of her stuff, and it's really, really good. And when I was reaching out and doing live chats with other authors about publishing, about working on the book, and there was something that I heard once. Well, as soon as I heard it, I was like, "You're absolutely right." And it was like, you can't edit a blank page. So whether you're writing a short story, whether you're writing a children's book, whether you're writing poetry, whether you're writing directions to Edinburgh, you can't edit a blank page.
Right. So get busy writing or doing something. I just want to look and see if anyone has said anything here. Yeah, Janet says, thanks, very intense and suspenseful, and you read so well. And and she says, wow, you already have the ending of the series, volume 6. Yeah. And Sherry says, thank you so much. I find your literary knowledge is so fantastic and your research is fantastic. That's the other thing I noticed, is how committed to research you are.
Yes.
Where does that come from?
I want to get it right.
Mm-hmm.
I want it to be as I'm writing about fictional, mythical creatures that don't exist, but I want it to be as real as it can. Which is why I'm not going into myth and fantasy, etc. I read a lot. And just before I actually started reading, there was quite a few werewolf books that I was reading. Some were very good, others not so good. And there was one book I was given as a gift by a good friend of mine. And I knew the author. I didn't know he'd written a werewolf book. And it was like, what do you think of this? And my personal opinion, it was awful. I didn't like it at all. And it was like, how can werewolves fly? What? No, I didn't enjoy the book. And that sort of set me on the path of, right, if they were real, Because when I was looking into the different mythologies, practically every civilization around the world in their mythology, there's people who change shape. Not just Central Europe, Ireland, etc. A lot of the even more ancient mythologies, there's one from Central Africa where there's legends of this entire tribe that when they were in battle, they would change into giant cats, giant leopards. The Australian Aborigines have similar, and these are civilizations that there was no contact. There's no known contact between. And likewise, I heard of one Inuit myth and legend where there's one person that changes into a bear. And so this got me thinking, I mean, all these mythologies, I mean, these populations, these peoples had no contact. But the common thing with a lot of the mythology was people who could change shape. And when I looked at like myths and legends that we can trace the history of, because most myths and legends are based on something. The legend of Robin Hood. Robin Locksley was a real person. That person existed for real. If we were able to go back in time and meet him, was he anything like the legend? Probably not. The history surrounding William Wallace, I'm from a Scottish background, some of the legends about him, I'm sure if we went back and met the real person, probably not the same. You know, the same predictor, etc. and all. King Arthur, I mean, King Arthur again was a real person, but the mythology that's grown up around them, is that what they were like for real? Probably not. So what were they like for real? And this is what got me, and that's what started me off. And my initial idea for my story plot was 3 books, and the more certainly by the time I got halfway through volume 2, I was like, right, this is more than 3 books. From where I could see the story expanding. When I looked at the legend of vampires and vampirism, vampirism is real. It's found in nature. Most famous being the vampire bat, but there are other creatures. You know, look at that, and that sort of again got me thinking. And there is vampires in my stories, and I found out the word vampire. A lot of people think it's Latin. It's actually not. It's an ancient Russian word, vampire, and so that got me going off as well. So that's why there's and I did look at the, you know, why do vampires and werewolves in practically every single story? Why are they fighting with each other? You know, why can't they get along? And then just sort of looking at Irish history, and yeah, our history, we don't get on very well in our history, you know. So
well, that's kind of what I was thinking in terms of this, the kind of the friction between in your books is kind of a universal inability for different people or people of different cultures to get along. And so I feel that kind of is being expressed in your, brilliantly, by the way, in your novels. And one of the things I wanted to say was I've made notes about the incredible detail that in that brief reading that I felt like I was right in the landscape. So your research and having been there, that makes a whole lot of sense. Thank you. I have a couple of things here. Sherry, so what do you think the evolution of the werewolf could be? Every species can adapt and change and not do something outlandish?
Also, yeah. I found out from the 2 biologists that I spoke to when I was asking about DNA changing shape. Change DNA is real, you know. So it's one of those things that, are the possibilities there? Yes. Is it something that we as a species should tamper with? No. I think nature's got it pretty well done. It's not something that for us to, you know, can we change things so people have wings? Forget it. No. There's probably a reason why we don't, you know. If the possibilities there, yes, but it's something I feel that nature should do herself, because she's done it so well so far over the last couple of million years. No.
Absolutely. And Janet says, research is such a vital component of your work. I can see that. And your approach of the paranormal and cryptid entities with a scientific sense of skepticism and realism, thus making us believe even more, which is so absolutely right on as far as I'm concerned.
The other part of that, she just finished off with Vlad the Impaler.
Yes, exactly. That's right. Yeah.
I mean, people know Vlad the Impaler from history, but people forget that his full name, Count Vladimir Dracula. Count Dracula was a real person, and the way he basically got his name written into history, the Ottomans had launched their successful campaign to capture Constantinople, which is now modern-day Istanbul. It had stood as a fortress. 29 different emperors had tried attacking Constantinople, all had failed. After it had fallen, the Ottomans, in a zeal of like, we've done this, and they were launching an invasion of Europe in the 1300s, and with their idea of, we will conquer all Europe, we will burn Rome, we will destroy Christianity and make Europe Islamic. So their forces were coming up through the modern-day Balkans. They'd fought campaigns with the Greeks, etc. So they're coming down to modern-day Romania, Serbia, etc. And from my visits to those countries, I found out the history of where these happened. Modern-day Kosovo, there was a big battle in 1412 where the Serbian, Greek, and Russian Orthodox forces met. And basically that was the final battle where they defeated the Ottomans. And the Ottomans retreated to modern-day Albania, which is why Albania is the only Islamic country in Europe. On the sort of fringes of that, there was a force of Ottomans that was coming into modern-day Romania, and especially the part of the country of Transylvania. And they were outnumbered. The Transylvanians, Count Dracula and his forces were outnumbered some drastic measure. But they knew the land, they knew the country. So you've got these massive, massive forces, and they knew where they could ambush them. And that's what they did. They basically fought a guerrilla campaign. And Count Vladimir came up with this psychological warfare where any Ottomans he captured alive, he would impale them. It's not a nice way to go, by the way. And he didn't just do it once or twice, he did it to tens of thousands of them. And he had them all on the hillside. So the Ottomans could see this. And to them, this was the devil incarnate. This was the way he was killing them. They couldn't perceive this. And he used to stand and toast, and it said that he had a large goblet of red wine, and he would drink it and then throw it over himself. But the Ottomans thought he was drinking the blood of his victims. And it was the Irish author, Bram Stoker, who looked at that and then wrote that fantastic book, Dracula. So Dracula was a real person. Did he drink blood? Probably not. But he made the Ottomans think that, and they retreated.
Wow. That's great. I mean, really, your knowledge is incredible. And so I can see how your story comes to life because of the amount of knowledge you have about the history, the mythology, and what is or could be true, and what is absolutely not possible. Anybody else have anything that they would like to ask or say? So we do have a bit more time. Would you like to read a little bit more, or yes, please? Yeah.
I've got a wee bit. This is from volume 2, and this is down in my beloved Mourne Mountains. Compared with the Rocky Mountains, the Mourne Mountains are just a couple of hills. You know, but I love being there. I love being down there. Very much headspace for me. I love being out in the open. I love being in the countryside, and it's just beautiful. So what's happening so far in the story here in book 2, the clan of werewolves, the Anrua, have got issues going on. The vampires, the Noctralis, are making their presence felt. There's things going on in the country, but that's happening elsewhere in the story. In amongst that, there's started being these werewolf attacks in around the Mourne Mountains. There's a character that's introduced who's German, and you find out later on in the story exactly her background. And well, I can tell you because somebody who's read this. She's rabid. You know, I looked at what effect would rabies have on an actual werewolf, and it was going back to the legends from Central Europe. So that got me thinking, how would a group of wolves in the wild react to another wolf, probably disease coming into their territory? And so I found several documentaries. There's a very good one called Wild Alaska. And they were looking at that. I found another documentary about wolves in around the Alps of Europe and how they reacted to other wolves coming in. So that sort of, okay, let's do this. So what's happening is the Anrua, which is Irish for of red, because most of them have got red hair, you know, and they've sent 4 teenagers down who are werewolves, but they're all trackers, to investigate this to see if it is a werewolf. So it's down near Spelga Dam in the Mourne Mountains. So they've arrived and they're setting off. They've been there a few days and they're a bit bored. All 4 stopped suddenly and looked towards the summit of the mountains as the sound of the long howl echoed. Will stepped forward, staring at the slope. It must be at least 2 miles away. Gemma released her grip and both the girls react. Sorry, I should say the 2 twins. There's twin boys and twin girls from separate families. It must be on the other side of Cock Mountain, Gemma asked. Rocky Mountain, Emma corrected. Will stepped forward and looked back at the 3 of them. Right, we've a job to do. This is the first trace we've had. Let's get on with it. Will started off down the road with the others just behind him. They were running as they reached the small metal gate with a break in the wall. Then they were off the road and onto the dirt track that cut into the side of the hill. It only took them seconds to reach the footbridge that crossed over the river. It was a metal construction designed for only one person to cross at a time. The rocks at the far side were open and bare. The side of the first mountain rose above them. Come on, said Will as he started up the hill. They were not quite running, but they scaled the side of Slimsakin in a quarter of a time that it would normally take hill walkers. They were committed and now they were in a hurry. At the top, they all paused. Emma looked over to her left at the dam and the reservoir. She could make out the small car park and there were 2 cars. A heavy blanket of cloud filled the sky, leaving only a few gaps. They continued on. Beyond lay the rest of the Mourne Mountains. It was really breathtaking. There had been frost on the ground that had become slippery. Will stopped at the far side of the summit. The others soon caught up. It only took a few seconds for them to catch their breath. Gemma pointed to the smaller hill and the exposed rock in the summit off to the right. Is that Rocky Mountain? No, Will said. That's Hen. Rocky's the other side of it. He pointed at the mountains on that. Is that Cock? Emma asked, pointing a further peak. Cock Mountain is a real mountain, by the way. And she was, Emma could not help herself from smiling at the juvenile comment. No, the 3 of them laughed. Richard extended his left hand and pointed. Look at that, he said, walking ahead. Emma could not see what he was pointing at. He stopped and was looking down at something just out of sight. They all walked over to where the dead lamb lay. Will went down on one knee beside what was left of the animal. It was lying on its right side. The rear leg was missing from the hip joint. It had been torn off with excessive force. The massive wound in the neck exposed everything from the chin to the chest. The damage was too extreme to be caused by a normal predator. They had found the first evidence in their search. Will extended the palm of his hand, so just over the carcass. Still warm, less than half an hour. He stood up as the 2 girls studied the lamb. Richard looked over at something. Blood trail, he stated. Will looked over. Where? He asked. Richard walked around the lamb and stopped a few feet away. He looked down at the ground and pointed. The other three gathered around. There. Tracks as well. He indicated the trail, easily visible through the frost. Blood there and there. Single, non-human, but upright. The evidence would not last long. Will went down on one knee and looked over the closer the paw print on the frosty ground. Well, at least we know it's definitely a garou. But what are they doing here? Gemma asked. Will looked up at her. Well, let's go find out, shall we? He stood smiling. His brother's face was grim. Emma nodded before she spoke. Let's get moving. She began pacing between each print, moved from side to side, following the trail closely. From the size and depth of the print, I would say that it's a she, and she was running. The others followed Emma. Emma looked up at the top of Cock Mountain, and she could see through the mist that still covered it. Their pace increased as they ascended the mountain in silence. Out of the mist appeared several slabs of rock, forming what looked like a natural bench. The four trackers stopped beside it. Visibility had reduced to less than 30 meters. Emma took off the hat that she'd been wearing and tucked it into a pocket, noticing her sister was already doing the same. They were only slightly out of breath, but no one spoke. Emma searched across for what she could see. The whole atmosphere had changed. Something was wrong here. She glanced at her sister, who had a nervous look on her face. She felt it too. Will slowly unkipped his day sack and placed it on the ground in front of him. The others quietly did the same. Gemma stood beside her sister as they scanned their surroundings. When Richard stepped closer to Emma, she glanced at him. Whatever was there, he felt it as well. He kept looking over to his left. Will slowly paced around the rock slab, walked forward a short distance and stopped. He stood and stared in front of him. Then, without turning around, slowly stepped backwards. There was a concerned look on his face. He nodded down at the day sacks. Everyone knelt down, opened their packs, and withdrew their sheathed swords. They followed Will's lead down, opening their pack. Oh, sorry, just read it. As he slowly walked back around the rock slab, the two girls were just behind him on either side, with Richard following. There was only a short distance between them as the diamond formation moved slowly forward, slowly and quietly. They passed an upright boulder, apparently guarding the entrance to a small bowl-shaped dip in the ground. At its deepest point, the bowl was only about 3 feet deep, but it was still deep enough. The lamb was not the only thing that had been killed. Emma looked around the small group as it made its way towards the centre of the bowl. She counted at least 3 adult sheep that had all been torn apart ahead of her. Will stopped and slowly unsheathed his sword. The sound of the blade leaving the sheath broke the silence. One by one, the others did the same. There was nervousness amongst them. Gemma, Will whispered, just barely audible. What? She quietly answered. Emma was listening, her eyes searching the mist for any detail, any movement. She sensed the danger. Get in touch with the farm. He was being as quiet as possible. Gemma went down on one knee and taking the sword in her left hand, fumbled in the pocket of her trousers for her phone. She tapped the button and whispered, "No signal." There was a pause before Will spoke again. "Can you send him a message?" Emma could hear her sister rapidly tapping the buttons. "Yes," came the quiet reply. "Send them this." Gemma tapped, then paused, waiting for the message. "We have a female rabbit." There was a gasp from Gemma. Richard started to breathe forcibly through his nose, and Emma could feel her heart thump inside the chest. "The message is sent, but I don't know when they'll get it." Emma could hear how scared her sister was as she tightened the grip on the handle of her blade. Taking a deep breath in, she readied herself for the coming fight. A light breeze passed over them. They all reacted to the smell. She was close. She was upwind, which meant she knew that they were there. She wanted them to know it. Emma felt fear grip her, eyes fighting against the mist as the breeze cleared it slightly. "Did you say exactly where we are?" Will asked, his voice somewhat louder than before. "No." "Send it quick." he commanded. Gemma fumbled for her phones as the others searched in different directions. I don't want to be here, Richard stated quietly. His voice had changed. This time it was not annoyance, but fear. They all knew what rabies could do to a single wolf. They'd never seen it, but it was their greatest fear. The noise stopped them. All four turned towards it. A low growl. Emma took an unconscious step back as Gemma and Richard turned and raised their swords defensively. Will stepped closer, so it was on Emma's side. He had a determined look on his face. Pairs, stay in pairs, he stated. What? Asked a nervous Richard. Do not let yourself get separated. If we stay together, we can survive. We will live. He held his sword in both his hands. A determined look was turning to anger as the dark shape appeared out of the mist. She was on all fours and stopped a short distance away from them. She was well built and the short fur around her face was splattered with blood. She lowered her head and each of them recognized the madness in her eyes. There would be no reasoning, no compassion. There was only rage in the bloodshot of the eyes. Slowly, saliva dripped from her mouth. The low growl emanated. She raised her head slightly and took a long breath in through her nose. She knew that smell. She knew what they were. The rage in her eyes was now mixed with excitement. Who are you? Will shouted, just as she suddenly leapt forward. He stepped to one side as the mouth snapped at the space where he'd been standing in. Her body slammed into Emma, sending her flying backwards. She lost her grip on her sword and it skittered harmlessly away. She landed on the rock and pain shot through her body. Rolling over, she lunged towards where the sword lay on the ground. The rabbit was jumping back and forth between them, snapping and grabbing at them. They fought frantically. Emma jumped up and ran forward just as the rabbit swung around with an open hand, claws outstretched towards Richard's face. He ducked and brought his sword up. The blade and the claws clashed. The rabbit jumped back, narrowly avoiding a full impact. Everything was moving so fast. The rabbit launched another attack, this time aimed at Will. He rolled sideways and brought his sword up, just missing her face. The rabbit was mid-air as her right hand caught Emma's arm. She landed and turned, flinging Emma around like a rag doll. Gemma's body slammed into the vertical rock with such force that a scream she'd been making stopped as suddenly it started. Rage. Emma was now filled with rage. She launched at the rabbit. She missed. The rabbit spun and launched back. Emma was caught by her shoulder and thrown backwards. She landed on her back and her body exploded in pain. She righted herself just as Will spun round and deflected another swipe. In that second, Emma realized, just as Will did, that he had not been the target. Richard's sword had found its mark and the fur parted, but he had made a catastrophic mistake. She had let him get close. He'd overextended his blade and for less than half a second, he had left himself vulnerable. Her mouth had found his throat even before his fingers let go of the blade. She drove at him with such force his head bounced into the air like a football. The rabbit spun around at the edge of the far edge of the bowl and stopped. She now focused her attention on Will, not taking her eyes off him. So he slowly paced around the edge, circling. Emma jumped forward to his side. Come on then, he was shouting, beckoning her with his sword. The rabbit's eyes were full of hate. She snapped at them and changed direction, never taking her eyes off them. Emma was about to shout something, but before she could form the words, the rabbit launched the attack. Both their blades missed. The right hand of the rabbit swatted her away as if she was a fly. Emma landed outside the bowl. She had lost her sword. She fought the pain and righted herself. Suddenly, Will came into focus. The rabbit was on top of him. Emma watched as the wild animal tore into him with more savagery than she'd ever imagined. His anger turned to squeals of pain and anguish. She was transfixed. Emma had never seen anything like this before. The rabbit was tearing at him with her mouth, her hands, ripping, tearing, shredding. His clothes were gone. The body was being ravaged in the way she had not thought possible. She froze. Will's body stopped moving. The rabbit wasn't eating it. She was destroying it. Suddenly she looked up and met Emma's eyes. The fear took her. And she was running. She had never run that fast before. Everything inside her screamed to get away. Run, run, run. It was absolute uncontrolled panic, and it had taken her. She cried, she sobbed, she screamed, her body fought. The panic ran wild. She heard the double thud of the feet that were chasing her. She screamed, thud, thud. They were close, thud, thud. Closer still, thud, thud. She ran, run. She had to get away. Her mind had held only one thought. The fear had overtaken her. It drove her. It pushed her on, thud, thud. The footfall was gaining. She had to run, thud, thud. Panic made her scream. She'd forgotten about her sword, about her day sack, thud, thud. Closer, then silence. Emma Silver never heard the rabid wolf jumping through the air. It landed on her back, sending her face down into the cold ground. The panic would only last a few more seconds. The pain would last longer, but not much longer.
Well, I actually gasped, literally, when the wolf. What did you call the wolf?
The rabbit.
The rabbit. When the rabbit attacked the young man, I just went like, oh my goodness. Anybody else want to say something? I've got goosebumps. My heart.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, so people here have said beautifully described and keeps moving at an exciting pace, and this is excellent. My goodness, it certainly is, absolutely. Like sit on the edge of your seat kind of excitement going on and going on and going on. So brilliant, I have to say. This has been a really great reading. I'm so glad that we did this. It's just about 2 o'clock, so we're right on target. Once again, Iain, thank you so much. And I know that Candace, when she sees the recording, she's going to be very pleased with the work that you've done here today, and as she is with the writing that you do. So thank you, everybody, for coming by. It was great. Let's see. This is excellent. Just want to say thank you. Cheers. Love to be creeped out. That female wolf was quite intimidating and excellent reading. So yeah, you've done it. Thank you. That was amazing. So thank you so much.